over the last few years, the practice of gratitude as a daily practice of some kind has become increasingly popular. So much so that recently I've even seen it referred to as the new science of gratitude. And that's really referring to a lot of the research that has been done in recent years on the subject of gratitude. Some of you might be thinking, well, saying please and thank you is something that we learnt as children, kind of related to the golden rule. So what's such a big deal about that? What's so special about that? Indeed, sometimes just the please and thank you is a little bit of a rote, automatically, yes, you're supposed to have good manners. And for many, saying thank you is simply about good manners. You know that it's necessary to say thank you. So when we speak about gratitude, we're speaking about something a little bit more than merely good manners. Gratitude has been defined as a thankful appreciation for what you receive, whether it's something you are given or something more intangible. It's said that with gratitude, people acknowledge the goodness in their lives. And in acknowledging the goodness in their lives, they usually recognize that the source of goodness is outside themselves. And it's that recognition that the source of what benefits me is outside of myself that allows gratitude to sometimes be defined as a spiritual practice. We don't necessarily mean spiritual as in the other worlds of whatever kind. We simply mean that aspect of the human being and the human experience that is beyond the everyday and mundane. As much as gratitude and saying thank you might be part of our everyday lives, its meaning, its implications, and most importantly, its benefits are much larger than ourselves, our everyday lives. Gratitude allows people to connect to something bigger than themselves, whether that's just the other people, the other person that they realize is the source of goodness, or something larger all the way up to a higher power. So today I want to talk a little bit about gratitude and how to cultivate gratitude, because of all the important research that has come out recently, that gratitude is not only about being thankful, but that it can fundamentally alter your experience of life and even the rest of your life, even perhaps altering your brain for the better. Perhaps like many of us, when I first encountered this idea of gratitude as a daily practice, I thought, okay, that could be something useful. There was a time when keeping a gratitude journal was a popular practice. Maybe it still is for many people. And that is the simple act of every day writing down a few things that you're grateful for. And although I was skeptical at first of the real value of something like that, I thought it was maybe a little bit cheesy or a little bit too shallow. It's easy to reach for things that you're grateful for. Some people actually say it isn't easy to think of something every day. But you can go right down to the small things, and in that sense, it starts becoming a regular practice. But I began to think, since people are reaching for those everyday things all the time, does it really have any value? But the value is in the results that you see. And I certainly discovered that people who were practicing that had a genuinely different way of looking at the world. What has happened in recent years is that a considerable amount of research has been done, a lot of it at Harvard University as well as elsewhere, and that is the research that I'll be drawing on as I talk today. But what that research has shown is that gratitude can fundamentally change people and have a dramatic effect on things like depression as well as daily mood, and ultimately on how we approach the rest of our lives. So another definition of gratitude that I also find quite interesting is that gratitude is a way for people to appreciate what they have instead of always reaching for something new. Because it raises that question of why are we always reaching for something new? And one of the answers to that, at least, is that we live in this consumerist world that is forever trying to tell us that we need what is new. Now, it's not only consumerism that does that. There's unmistakably a pattern when you look back at human experience and human history that we tend to think that new is good and new is better than. It's this idea of improvement. The theory of evolution might only have come up in the 19th century, but certainly we've always had this idea of getting better and better all the time. And that kind of evolution, that idea of progress is always creating an improvement, is something strongly entrenched in our belief systems. And perhaps in our everyday experience, although it's not necessarily always true. Something as an astrologer that I've always said is that we mustn't be misled by this idea that progress, time moving forward, is like an arrow going forward and upwards all the time, and this idea of forever improvement in some way. Because astrology shows that everything is cyclical and that things will return again and go around again and the same stuff will happen again, as plenty folk wisdom does tell us. But in the more modern era, because we live in such a consumerist society, we need to be persuaded that new is definitely better. We need to be persuaded that we're unhappy, and here's the solution to our happiness. But we buy that solution from people that we know are lying, because next year they're going to tell us, actually, what I sold you last year in order to make you happy isn't making you happy. Here's something that will make you happy. And so that cycle carries on ad infinitum. And while, none of us are strangers to the ravages of consumerism, it does expose the fact that not only do we rely on things outside of ourselves to make ourselves happy, but that reliance can be exploited by cynical purveyors of the latest product in order to sell their product. And what they are exploiting is our unhappiness. So certainly one of the ways to undo this is with gratitude. Gratitude is about focusing on what you do have, not on what you don't have. And although it sounds obvious, and sometimes a little bit, I used that word cheesy earlier on, and maybe it fits into the category of cheesy, really. The fact simply is that evidence-based research shows that the more you practice gratitude, even if in the beginning you're kind of faking it or forcing yourself, the more its permanent effect lasts and changes our experience of everyday life. There aren't many practices that can be experimentally shown to have such a lasting effect as gratitude practices are shown to have. The truth is, though, that gratitude is consistently associated with people who experience more happiness more of the time, with people who experience more positive emotions and who are able to experience things in a positive way. They tend to see things from the positive point of view. And of course, the net result of that is that they experience more positive emotion in general and describe their lives as having more positive experiences than people who don't practice that. It can also have effects beyond the individual's psychological framework. For example, people who practice gratitude tend to have better health, more able to deal with health crises or any other crisis, and more able to change that, as well as more able to build and maintain strong relationships. And it kind of turns out that gratitude is a simple daily practice that is pretty much simpler than many of the other ones we call spiritual practices, that has a much more measurable and lasting effect than most of them, as research shows. Because the thing about gratitude is that the practices of it, the ways that we develop it, are very tangible, easy to do types of practices. Later on, I'll mention some of the things we can do to develop our own sense of gratitude. But if you want to compare it to something that is simple, but that a lot of people struggle with, and that is something like meditation, we all know, or hopefully we all know, that a daily practice of meditation can profoundly enhance our spiritual, emotional, physical, and other aspects of our lives permanently. There's no doubt about that, and indeed research also shows that one to be true. So, good competition for gratitude. But a lot of people say, oh, today I had a good meditation, today I had a bad meditation, today I struggled. I struggled to keep up the habit, all of those things. And one of the reasons is because it's such a passive form of activity, and you're kind of just sitting there. And a lot of people find that difficult because their minds run, or the same world that I've been referring to, consumerist world, or it's not only consumerism, but it's because the world demands so much of it. So we've got this belief system that says doing is better than not doing, so I just better do something. So those make it a little bit more difficult. But gratitude is something that can be an everyday practice that doesn't require you to go and sit quietly at a special time of the day in a separate activity from the rest of the day. Some of the gratitude practices are that, make no mistake, but there's a lot about gratitude practice that can be in our ordinary everyday lives that is then you practicing your spirituality in your ordinary everyday life and seeing the benefits from it. So the obvious way is, of course, expressing gratitude towards the variety of things that come towards us during the course of our day. But by being more conscious of it, we can cultivate it. So one of the first places it starts, like with everything else, is in memory. We spend a lot of our time recalling things. Some people say our entire identity lies in our memory. Everything we experience and who we believe ourselves to be is all constructed out of memory. But one of the things we can do is when we do retrieve positive memories, because most of the memories we bring out are positive when we bring them up deliberately, is to find something within that that we are thankful for or grateful for, or to deliberately sit and remember things that we are grateful for. When bad memories come up, we can even think about, is there something in there that I can be grateful for now that I can look back on it? So applying gratitude to the past is a powerful practice because it allows us to firstly identify things which are obviously things we're grateful for, and also to revisit things which might have been difficult or problematical at the time, and we can find, was there anything good in that? Was there a blessing in that? Even if worst case scenario is, I'm grateful that I'm no longer in that situation with some bad memory. It focuses us on the gratitude part and ultimately focuses us on changing this attitude, because in the present it's about not taking things for granted and not consistently looking out towards the future in order to bring us something. The future is once I've got that, I'll be fine and happy. Once I've got the new phone, or once some other condition is met, I will be happy. The way to approach the future from a positive point of view is simply cultivating optimism about the future. And you can start at the simplest level that says, I know from past experience that whatever is going to happen in this scenario that I face in the future, there is going to be something good I can extract out of it. So whatever the situation really is, past experience shows us there will be something to be grateful for. And remember, gratitude is largely about understanding that benefits come from beyond ourselves. And so if the beyond yourself is the human, and I'm not necessarily talking about a greater power, the human experience that you face, it could be your boss, it could be something like that, then you can say, I can even expect that in that situation, which is going to be difficult at work, there will be something or someone I can be grateful for. And learning to focus on those things shifts our consciousness very strongly. From the research, it would appear that the most powerful act of cultivating gratitude that you can do on your own, apart from learning to express it in our everyday lives, is to write a letter to someone that you are grateful to who was never properly thanked for that kindness. Research later showed that it became irrelevant whether that letter was ever delivered to the intended recipient or not. But very powerfully, people who wrote that letter exhibited enormous increases in their happiness scores. It was the highest increase in a happiness score out of any kind of intervention in order to try and make people experience happiness. And it's the only one that lasted long beyond the letter writing exercise. To be specific, 30 days later, when the tests were done to measure levels of happiness, those people who had participated in an experiment in which they wrote this letter still showed the same high levels of happiness. Being a scientific experiment conducted by Harvard University, there was a control group that didn't write the letter, and they could literally compare the difference. It sounds small, but it's actually something very powerful, because sometimes with a spiritual practice, and you would imagine that gratitude was one of those, it's like you get this high and you think everything's great and everything's fine, and then it fades away after a while. It's like a peak experience that doesn't last. But interestingly, the letter writing experience for gratitude lasted 30 days, or longer than 30 days, was measurable still after 30 days, and it implies strongly that acts of gratitude have a strong, lasting effect on our happiness. And that's the key in the research that says, ultimately, it's a very powerful practice because it's got lasting results. It literally is changing the way that people see things and people do things. And that's why it's such an important practice. What was also interesting is that the changes in the brain, which were mostly in the prefrontal lobe, which is where a lot of our better judgment and more human characteristics really come from, those results were still measurable 3 months later. So it's believed that practicing gratitude actually trains the brain to be more sensitive to the experience of what they are grateful for, what they should be grateful for, what from the outside creates that sense of gratitude and happiness. Remember, we started off with the idea that it's learning to recognize that the source is good. The source of good is from outside of yourself. And that is what seems to be, from physical evidence in the brain, something that people learn to do from the practice of gratitude, continue to do, and then experience much greater happiness and benefits much more lastingly. And experience much greater happiness as well as other very strong psychological benefits, not the least of which is much less tendency towards depression and negative emotions and negative thoughts. That is a very powerful result. People look for medications, for all sorts of different spiritual practices in order to achieve that, but actually it's the simplest practice of all. It is something that you can do easily every day. So on the one hand, of course, writing that gratitude letter is a great idea to do, to cultivate that gratitude. And in a similar vein, the famous gratitude journal, writing down 3 or 4 or 5 things every day that you're grateful for. And now understanding that this process literally starts changing your brain and starts changing how you see other things. So don't filter what you allow yourself to be grateful for. And the evidence shows that within a month you have fundamentally changed the way that you think and the way that you experience your life. It's worth pointing out that the same experiment was done on teenagers and younger children, and it didn't have any effect on them. They were also asked to write a letter of gratitude, and there was no measurable effect on their levels of happiness. And so the psychologists involved also point out that gratitude is related to emotional maturity. That's something that is probably a little bit intuitive. It does make a kind of sense. But it also tells us that maybe the way that we teach children to be grateful can sometimes be a little bit too shallow. Thank you, as you must say thank you, is like it's a rote thing. Yes, it makes you polite and it makes you acceptable in polite society because you say thank you, and it's highly acceptable in our world. But of course the problem is, are you actually experiencing any gratitude? So maybe we should be teaching children about gratitude and what it really is and means, rather than saying thank you as what you're supposed to do in response to when people give you stuff. Just a thought. Two things that happen in the letter writing exercise that psychologists attribute to having some of that effect is that on the one hand, of course, attention is shifted away from whatever is negative in our lives or what we're experiencing as negative. So there's the shift of focus towards the things that we are grateful for and therefore make us feel happier. And the use of words and the consistent use of positive words also had a lasting effect on people. They found that the more people used positive words to describe their gratitude, the less they used negative words in any other area of life. And by negative words, I mean things that describe their own feelings and emotions. So describing your emotions and yourself in positive terms is a side effect of cultivating gratitude and expressing it in letter writing. And certainly it's better to deliver the letter, but the effect remains even if you don't. And that's a powerful thing. So even sitting down and writing about it, and writing that letter as if you were able to tell them, means that you can also be grateful for people who are no longer either alive or that you no longer have access to or in your past or something like that. It implies even that you can address some of the difficult people in your past by finding things to be grateful about, to express towards them, perhaps that they taught you, perhaps that they've helped you avoid in the future, or something like that. It's in order to build your positive emotional experience. It's not about forgiveness. It's about building positive experience through the consistent use of positive words to describe yourself and the identification of the source of good as coming from outside of yourself. So where does that leave us when it comes to cultivating gratitude? Other things you can do to increase your experience of gratitude is not only to write the gratitude journal or write the letter, but to do things like look back at your week or your month or at any time and count your blessings, reflecting on what went well for you, what really worked out, and finding things that have really worked for you that come from outside of you. Look for small things as well and see, how can I appreciate these little things? Write down in your journal a little bit of how you appreciate something that came your way, even if it is for the smallest reason. Ultimately, gratitude is easier said than done. We live in a very challenging world. It's full of difficult things, painful things. We can't pretend that they aren't happening. But what we can do is not just focus on the painful and the difficult, because we see challenging things in the world, and our feeling of pain and grief makes it hard for us to do something about it. So practicing gratitude is important. It consciously draws our attention to the significant good things in our lives, however small they may be. By learning to pay attention to the small but significant good things in our lives, we can literally change our brains. We will change our brains to notice the good more easily, to express the positive more easily, to avoid the negative more easily. This is scientific fact. And if we learn to rewire our brains that way, perhaps we can all be better people and make for ourselves a better world. Before I go, just to express my gratitude to you for watching and for keeping on watching every week. I'll see you next week with the month ahead.